In the spring of 1999, I was 26 years old, and I bought a farmhouse at the end of 9 Mile Grade, a gravel road that ran along the edge of the Coldwater State Forest in the hill country of southern Ohio. I'd just come out of a bad divorce, and I wanted quiet. The house sat on 11 acres, half of it woods, backed up against an old logging road that hadn't been graded since before I was born. There was a dry creek behind the barn, and further back, the raised dirt bed of a rail line that hadn't carried a train since the 1950s. The real estate agent called it secluded. My mother called it the middle of nowhere. I called it perfect. The nearest neighbor, a widower named Earl Prater, lived almost 2 miles down the road. The nearest town, Millhaven, was a 15-minute drive with a hardware store, a diner, and a sheriff's substation that was open Tuesdays and Thursdays. I had a cordless phone, an answering machine, a weather radio on the kitchen windowsill, and a dog named Copper that the shelter said was part collie. For the first month, it really was peaceful. I'd sit on the porch at night and listen to the whip-poor-wills and think I'd finally done something right. The first strange thing happened in June, and at the time I didn't think anything of it at all. I came home from the grocery store and the mailbox flag was up, even though I hadn't put anything in for the carrier to collect. I figured I'd bumped it myself that morning and forgot. Small thing, I didn't write it down anywhere because who writes down a mailbox flag? About a week later, Copper wouldn't go past the tree line at the back of the property. She'd walk right up to where the mowed grass turned into brush and just stop, ears back, and whine. I thought maybe there was a groundhog burrow or a skunk back there and left it alone. Then near the end of June, I noticed the bird feeder had been moved. I hung it from a shepherd's hook about 10 feet off the back porch, and one morning it was hanging from a low branch of the oak tree instead, a good 30 feet further into the yard. I asked myself if maybe I'd done it and forgotten, the way you do with small chores, but I knew I hadn't. I hung it back on the hook and didn't think about it again for a few days until I noticed it had been moved a second time, this time to the fence post by the garden. I want to be clear that none of this scared me yet. Each thing was small enough to explain away. A raccoon could tip a feeder, wind could work a mailbox flag loose. I was a new homeowner, and I didn't know yet which small things were normal and which ones weren't. Around that same time, my mail carrier, a friendly woman named Sandy who'd had the route for years, mentioned that she'd started leaving my mail a little differently than usual. She said some mornings the box was already open when she got there, like someone had checked it before her, and she'd taken to closing it firmer than she needed to just to see if it happened again. It did, more than once. I asked her if she'd seen anybody on the road near my place. She said only the one green pickup parked off at the tree line more mornings than she thought was normal for someone just passing through. I also lost a claw hammer and a pair of pliers out of the toolbox I kept on the back porch sometime that same month. I figured I'd left them somewhere in the barn and would turn them up eventually. I never did. It's a small thing to lose a hammer. It's a different thing to realize months later that it might not have wandered off on its own. The garden gate was the first thing that really stuck with me. I always latched it because Copper liked to dig in the tomato bed if she got the chance. One morning in July, I came downstairs and the gate was standing wide open, and there were fresh footprints in the soft dirt just inside it. Not my boot prints. Bigger, a man's size by the look of them, and pointed toward the house. I called Earl Prater since he was the only person close enough to have a reason to be on my land. He said he hadn't been by in weeks. He did mention, almost as an afterthought, that he'd seen an unfamiliar green pickup parked at the old logging road turnoff a few times that summer, just sitting there with nobody in it that he could see. He figured it was hunters scouting early, or somebody parking to walk the state land. I didn't think much of it at the time. Plenty of people used those turnoffs. By August, things were moving faster. My garden hose, which I always coiled by the spigot, was found stretched clear across the yard one morning, like somebody had unrolled the whole thing and left it. A pair of work gloves went missing from the porch rail and never turned up. And twice I came home in the evening to find the porch light switched off, even though I always left it on a timer. The first time I figured the bulb had burned out. It hadn't. The second time, I checked, and the timer switch itself had been flipped to off by hand. That was the first time I really felt afraid instead of just puzzled. I started locking the doors during the day, which felt strange in a place like that, where nobody locked anything. I also started keeping a little spiral notebook by the phone, writing down anything odd with the date next to it, the way you'd keep a mileage log. Looking back, that notebook is the only reason I can tell this story in order at all. In September, a local hunter named Dale Kessling stopped by to ask permission to bow hunt the tree line on the north side of my property, same as he'd done with the previous owners. While we talked, he mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd found a spot up on the ridge behind my house where somebody had cleared out a shooting lane through the brush. Real deliberate, cut low and clean, and it wasn't pointed at any deer trail he recognized. It was pointed straight down the hill at my house. He said he figured it was just another hunter getting an early start on a tree stand, and he didn't think much of it, but he thought I'd want to know since it was my land. I walked up there myself the next afternoon before I lost my nerve. He was right. Somebody had cut a narrow path through blackberry brambles and sumac, careful and quiet, wide enough for one person to move through without breaking branches or making noise. At the top, near an old fence line that marked the edge of the state forest, there was a flattened patch of leaves under a big shagbark hickory, like somebody had sat there or laid there more than once. I found 2 cigarette butts and a crumpled cellophane wrapper from a pack of crackers. From that spot, through a gap in the leaves, you could see my kitchen window and the driveway clear as anything. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I drove into Millhaven and reported it to the sheriff's substation. The deputy who came out, a heavy-set older man named Roy Ferris, walked the ridge with me and took it seriously in a way that surprised me. He said in his experience, a cleared lane like that, aimed at a house instead of a game trail, usually meant one thing, and it wasn't deer. He bagged the cigarette butts and the wrapper, though he was honest that without a suspect to match them to, they wouldn't do much good. He asked if I'd noticed anything else, and when I read him the list from my notebook, he went quiet for a second in a way I didn't like. He told me, carefully, that the Hendrick family, who'd owned the property 2 owners before me, had moved out of the county rather suddenly back in 1991. He didn't know the details. He said sometimes people just move, but he wrote it down. Not long after that visit, I did something I probably should have thought of sooner. I'd bought a disposable camera at the hardware store that summer, meaning to take some pictures of the garden for my mother, and I still had half the roll left. I set it on the kitchen windowsill one night, propped against the weather radio and aimed out at the back porch, and left it running until the flash bulb clicked off on its own sometime before morning. When I got the roll developed in town a few days later, most of the shots were nothing, just the dark yard and the porch rail, but one frame, taken sometime after 2 in the morning by the timestamp printed in the corner, showed a pale smear at the very edge of the picture, out near the cedars. That could have been a hand or a sleeve catching the flash, and could have been nothing at all. I brought it straight to Roy Ferris. He looked at it a long time and didn't say much, which told me more than words would have. After that, the sheriff's department started swinging a patrol car past my place once or twice a night, which Roy Ferris told me was more than they usually did for a report without a suspect, and I understood he was doing me a favor. For a couple of weeks, nothing new happened, and I let myself believe it might be over, that whoever it was had gotten scared off by the attention. Then, in the middle of October, I found a second lookout spot, this one much closer to the house than the first, tucked into a cluster of cedars less than 60 yards from my back porch. I only found it because Copper finally worked up the courage to go sniffing around the tree line, and I followed her. Somebody had nailed 2 small boards into the trunk of a cedar, like crude steps, just enough to get a person up about 8 feet off the ground. From there, you could see straight into my bedroom window. I did not sleep in that room again. I moved a cot into the front room downstairs and kept the weather radio on all night, more for the company of the sound than the forecast. Roy Ferris came back out with another deputy and they climbed up to look. Under the cedar, they found an old cracker box, the kind with a folding lid, and inside it was a spiral notebook, swollen with damp, the pages mostly ruined. What they could make out was rows of times and dates, going back further than I'd owned the house. Some entries lined up with the Hendrick family's years there. One of the deputies said, low, that whoever kept it had been documenting the house, not just watching it, for the better part of a decade. That was the point where I understood I wasn't the target. The house was. Around Halloween, an elderly woman from town, Mrs. Pauline Dietz, came into the hardware store while I was there buying a deadbolt and struck up a conversation after she overheard the clerk asking how the sheriff's visits were going. She told me, quiet and matter-of-fact, that back in the 70s, a different family had lived on that same road, a half-mile further along near the rail grade, and that they'd had similar troubles. Things moved, a gate left open, a shape seen once at the edge of their yard at dusk that never came closer and was never explained. She said the family sold up within 2 years. She said the local paper had run a small piece about it at the time, more curiosity than crime story, and that nothing had ever come of it. I went to the Millhaven Library and found that article on microfilm. It was 4 short paragraphs, no photograph, no name for a suspect. It read almost exactly like my own notebook. The last week I lived in that house, the porch light went out again, twice in 1 week, and on the second night, Copper started barking at the tree line around midnight and would not stop until nearly 2 in the morning. I sat on the front room cot with every light in the house on and the phone in my lap, and I did not sleep at all. In the morning, there were fresh footprints circling the entire house, pressed into the frost, evenly spaced, like someone had walked the full loop more than once. I called a realtor that same week. Roy Ferris organized one more search before I left, walking the state forest boundary with 2 other deputies and a retired forest ranger who knew the old logging roads better than anyone in the county. They found a 3rd site, further out than the other 2, near the collapsed grade of the old rail line, with a rough lean-to built from deadfall branches and an army surplus poncho, big enough for a person to sit dry through a rainstorm. It looked recently used. A coffee thermos sat inside it, and Ferris told me later, almost like he didn't want to, that the coffee inside was still faintly warm when they found it. They never found who it belonged to. There were no clear boot prints on the hard ground, no vehicle they could tie to it, nothing but that thermos and the notebook and the 2 cut paths through the brush. I sold the house in December of 1999 for less than I paid for it, to a young couple from Columbus who didn't ask many questions and who I didn't feel right telling the whole story to, though I did tell them to keep the porch light on a timer and to check it now and then. I moved into town, then out of state a few years after that, and I have never gone back to 9 Mile Grade. I heard secondhand a long time later that a hunter walking the state forest boundary sometime in the mid-2000s came across a 4th lookout, further up the ridge than any of the ones the sheriff had found, and that wedged into a hollow in the trunk of an old sycamore near it were a handful of Polaroid photographs, sun-faded and curling, of that same farmhouse taken from different angles across what looked like several different years. I don't know if that's true. I've never been able to confirm it, and I've never gone digging to find out, because some part of me doesn't want to know what year on that timeline I'd fall into, or what I might be standing in. I still close every curtain before the sun goes down. I don't expect that to ever change.